Hey, welcome back to the Métropole Grid. My name is Andre. Thanks so much for tuning in. Today we're continuing on our Deck Building 101 video series, and we're going to be building our second deck, our second corporation deck out of System Gateway. Today, we're going to be focusing on a deck that wants to do a lot of damage and actually flatline the runner. Now, we're going to be diving into this in a second, but if you haven't watched the first video in the series where we go over some basics about deck building, corporation deck building in general, explain factional deck building, and build our first ever HB deck in System Gateway, I'd recommend watching that first because we go over a bunch of very broad ideas that we'll reference today, and also we explain the user interface on Netrunner DB that we'll be using. Again, watch that first if you can. The link is in the description because right now we're going to be using those ideas and building a wilder deck that, again, wants to flatline the runner. Now, to start to understand what we're doing, I just want to show you a card from the original 2012 core set that Fantasy Flight Games put out now over a decade ago. And this was a very important card back then. It was called Project Junebug, and this was a Jinteki asset. It was an ambush. So it was a card that you installed on the table and advanced, and it looked like an agenda. But once the runner accessed this card, as long as you had at least one credit, when the runner touched this card and found out, oh, it's not an agenda, it turned out, in fact, to be a whole bunch of net damage. A very common play pattern with Junebug is you would say install Advance, either in an iced remote server or a brand new remote server with no ice in front of it, and you just dared the runner. Do you want to run that? Could be an agenda that I'm going to score next turn for pretty cheap, or it could be 4 net damage. Now, this was quite fun for a lot of people. Back then, Jinteki did a fair bit of net damage in the core set, so this was kind of their thing. But also, it kind of felt bad sometimes, the Junebug, on the corporation side of the table. Because if you spent your turn doing install advance, putting a Junebug in a remote server, whether it's iced or not, what about the runner didn't run the Junebug? What if they thought, okay, I'm pretty sure that's a Junebug, I don't want to touch it. As a corporation, there's not much you could do with the Junebug on most board states. You spent your whole turn, you spent a card, you spent a bunch of credits advancing, which was pretty expensive back then. Money was a bit more limited on the corp side, but that was that. Your trap failed. And then later on in a couple turns, if this was in your iced remote server, you would have to overinstall on top of it and push the next agenda or the next trap, whatever it was. But it kind of felt bad. If it failed really, really hard. Now, why I'm pointing that out is that here in System Gateway, we have a very similar card, except we don't have that feels bad moment. This is Urtica Cipher. And very similarly, it looks like an agenda. You can install advance this in a remote server. And then when the runner runs into this and accesses it, thinking they're stealing a good old agenda we put on the table, either behind ice or just in a new server, they end up taking, again, 4 net damage. And while 4 net damage might not be lethal, it's up to the runner to run with enough cards in hand, and 4 is not that hard to have 4 cards in hand. We have a very different landscape when it comes to Urtica Cipher and advanceable traps in System Gateway. If the runner doesn't run Urtica Cipher, what do we do? And the answer is, and the big thesis to this video and the deck we're going to be building in System Gateway, if you install Advance in Urtica Cipher and the runner says, I'm pretty sure that's a trap, I'm not going to run it, your next turn, you just keep advancing the Urtica. Next turn, advance it twice more, and then pass the turn over to the runner with 4 advancements on the Urtica Cipher. If they don't run that, keep advancing it. Next turn, put up to 2 more advancements on it. Now it's on 6 advancements. This is the big thesis of this deck, is that we're going to play big traps like Urtica Cipher, and every turn, if the runner doesn't run them, we're just going to continue to advance the card until something terrible happens. And you can do this in System Gateway and understand why this is a much better play than it was back in the day. We have to look at 2 other cards that also come alongside in System Gateway. Firstly, it's Clearinghouse. This card is so important for this sort of strategy. It's a Wayland asset. It's not exactly an ambush, but you put this on the table and then you advance it. If the runner does not run this card, you can res it at the end of their turn or the beginning of your turn. And at the start of turn trigger, this will do meat damage equal to the number of advancements on it. This is the big reason why the runner has to be scared if you just keep advancing your cards. Because if it comes to the start of your turn and this has 6 advancements on it, if it's a Clearinghouse, it'll just do 6 meat damage. Now, generally, the runner has 5 hand size. There is technically a way in System Gateway to get additional hand size, but if they don't, 6 meat damage will flatline every runner in System Gateway. You just win no matter how many points you have or, of course, the runner has. Again, if the runner ever has to take more damage than they have cards in hand, that is a flatline. That is the alternate win condition you have as a corporation. Now, nothing like this existed back in the core set in 2012. And this is the big reason why, if your trap fails, just keep advancing your trap. Because once the Urtica comes to 6 advancements, the runner has to understand, if that's a Clearinghouse, I lose. So now they really have to decide to run it. And if they run it and call it wrong, that's 8 net damage, and that's much easier for that to be a lethal problem for the runner. Now, it's not just Clearinghouse, which is pretty exciting. There's another card in System Gateway that's called Neurospike. It's a Jinteki operation. And when you play Neurospike, it does X net damage, where X is equal to the number of agenda points you've scored this turn. which means, say that we install advance, and Urtica Cipher on the turn and the runner doesn't run it. Next turn, we advance it twice more. Now it's on 4 advancements. That will do 6 net damage, which the runner can survive if they draw it before they touch it. But say that they don't run it. And instead of it being an Urtica Cipher, it's, say, a send a message. Say instead of the Urtica, it's an agenda we put on the table, and specifically a big agenda. That means when our turn starts and this has 4 advancements on it, for click 1, we advance it. It goes to 5 advancements. Then we just score it out. And then our next 2 clicks are Neurospike into Neurospike. Each of these Neurospikes will do 3 damage because we scored 3 points this turn, and that's 3 plus 3, that's 6. That will again flatline the runner. And so this is the landscape in System Gateway. The card on the table, if it has 2 advancements, that's annoying. It could be an agenda we score next turn, but that's okay. If it has 4 advancements and the corporation has 2 Neurospikes in hand, that potentially is a 5-3 agenda they could lose. The runner has to consider running a 4 advanced Urtica Cipher. Now, if they don't run that, you can keep advancing it. If it has 6 advancements, it might be a clearinghouse, and then they really have to consider running that. Now, if they don't run that, admittedly, yeah, that's a bit awkward. Generally, if it was a clearinghouse, they would have flatlined. So at that point, okay, they've survived. But the point is that the stakes are so high now that they have to consider checking at multiple different times. And again, the thesis here is that if they don't run your trap, keep advancing your trap. And as long as they're aware of what the card pool is and the risks they're taking, at some point, they have to consider running it. Notably, too, sometimes these cards compound in a good way. Like, you don't also have to have only 1 trap on the table. The idea is that if we have an Urtica Cipher with 4 advancements and another card on the table with 2 advancements, these cards compound well together. If the runner runs one of them and takes a whole bunch of damage, we can then res the clearinghouse and maybe that flatlines. So you don't also need a board state with only 1 big trap. You can have multiple traps. And now the runner has to understand if they're both clearinghouses, I could take 4 damage and 4 damage. And this also gets very interesting. Now that's what we're going to be doing today. We're going to be building a deck in System Gateway, explaining all our choices and how we ended up here. And our goal is to play big old traps like Urtica Cipher, keep advancing things, and ideally flatline the runner, either by their inaction or their direct action when they find out where our traps are on the table. And the one thing we want to keep in mind, if the trap fails, just keep advancing the trap. Now, of course, we're on Netrunner DB. We're logged in and we want to build a new corporation deck, which opens up the page in which we have to select which identity we want to play. Now, there's no way to highlight only the System Gateway identities here, which is a bit of a bummer, but we largely just need to pick which of the 4 factions we want to play, because there's only 4 identities in System Gateway on the corporation side. Now, we've already built the HB Precision Design deck. We're going to try and build something else. And I think we have 2 large choices when it comes to what faction we want to play our damage deck in System Gateway. Firstly, on Jinteki, we have Restoring Humanity. And while the identity box on Jinteki Restoring Humanity doesn't directly interact with our game plan, it does give us a couple free credits throughout the game, and that's nice. Advancing cards is expensive. But I think the biggest thing is a lot of the cards that we looked at so far are Jinteki cards. So this might be more about the card pool that we get to play with as opposed to the text box on the RH, the Restoring Humanity ability itself. The other 2 options we have is we have the NBN deck, Reality Plus. This cares more about tags than anything else. We don't inherently care about tags, so we're going to ignore this. And finally, which is an interesting choice as well, is we have Wayland's Built to Last. Now, I think, again, we'll have to spend a lot of our influence importing Jinteki cards, but I do think you can make this deck make sense in Wayland. And that's because Wayland gives you credits the first time you advance a card. And as you heard in our game plan, we want to install advance many cards and continue to advance those cards. So this will make the first advancement cheaper. Now, the other advancements you do have to pay fair market prices for, but I do think you could consider building this deck out of Built to Last. Now, today, because we're going to be playing a lot of Jinteki cards and having a bit of free money is fine, we're going to try out Restoring Humanity. There's a couple other reasons why we pick this identity, and it's mostly to do with a lot of the ice, and Restoring Humanity does damage. And damage means that the runner won't have as many cards in hand if they're face checking into their ice, and then they'll be easier to flatline with our traps and our tricks. So I think it lines up pretty well. Again, we'll talk about this identity box, but it's not the most important thing. Now, once we pick that, we're in the deck builder. We just want to make sure our collection is still set to only System Gateway. So we're going to hit the None button here and just System Gateway to only show us System Gateway cards in the deck builder. And then at the bottom here, we're going to scroll down and hit Casual, which just says ignore the standard ban list. Since the last videos we put up, there are now cards banned from System Gateway in the standard card pool. So it is very important that you're hitting this button. Just make sure you're hitting this button. Otherwise, you won't see all the System Gateway cards because of the standard ban list. Now, when we built our HB deck, we compartmentalized things and we said we're going to build the agendas first and then the ice and then the upgrades because we understood our deck game plan, which was score agendas behind ice with defensive upgrades. Here, we're going to do something slightly differently. We understand the cards we want to put in our deck because we understand what our win condition is, which is putting traps on the table and continuing to advance them. So I'm going to start there and just add all the cards that are important for the sort of trap win condition, and then we'll be building around that spot. Again, you don't have to build decks. When we did this on the runner side as well, where we started with one category of cards and then a second category, sometimes you can just start with, okay, these are the cards I want to play with, and then just build around that, filling in the empty spaces of the other stuff that the deck still needs. So for us, we want to play all the traps. So for instance, we know that we want to play Urtica Cipher because this is the asset that we want to advance to make the runner flatline when they run into this when it has a lot of advancements. I think we're going to play 3 of these just because we want to get them on the table as soon as possible to install advance. What I do think is pretty funny is there's a chance you can play fewer of these, play 2 of them, just so that the runner can never find the third copy, which means it's always hiding somewhere. And they always have to imagine, okay, that card in their remote server could be an Urtica. That is actually a genuine problem. If the runner finds all 3 Urtica ciphers and they're in archives, they know there's no more Urtica ciphers, and then they actually can run and should run everything on the table. So do keep that in mind. We'll try and get Urtica ciphers shuffled back into the deck to make it unobvious where they are, but playing 2 is kind of funny here. We're going to be playing 3 of those. The next card we want is Clearinghouse, and we can just search that here. Now, Clearinghouse is 3 influence, which is the one thing that's going to restrict us from maybe playing a quick 3 copies of this. It's a very important card for the deck, of course, because it's one of the few cards the runner doesn't run, they can lose the game. But we'll play 2 for now and see if we have more influence to get the third copy in. It's also not a card you really want in your opening hand because it is slow and a bit expensive. And if the runner runs it, paying 3 to trash it is something. But it's different than the Urtica that takes 4 cards out of them in the early game. That can be quite impactful. So we'll play 2 copies for now. Now, the other card we talked about is Neurospike, and this is a very important card, and we actually want as many copies of this as we can play, because we generally are going to need multiple copies of this in our hand to do the combo. The idea is that if we score out a 3-point agenda, we need to do Neurospike for 3 damage into Neurospike for 3 damage, so we just want to make sure we have 2 copies of this in our hand as soon as possible, so we'll play the full 3. Then, of course, we need a 3-point agenda, and the 3-point agendas that we have in System Gateway, we only have one option, and that is going to be, of course, send a message. So if we just want to have as many things on the table that could be send a message into Neurospike, we're going to be playing 3 copies of send a message. At this point, we've already filled out a quarter of the deck. We're at 11 cards, which is not too bad, and now we're just going to build out the rest of the deck around the shell in a way that maybe makes sense. I guess we might as well just fill out the agendas while we're here. Now we already have 9 agenda points, and we're going to be playing a deck that is 44 cards and 18 agenda points. If you want to hear more about that, again, that's in the first corporation deck build. We talk a lot about that, but that's what we want to do. Now, every faction in System Gateway, you're mostly going to be playing neutral agendas, but you do have access to a single tin limit 1 per deck agenda in your faction. And this is Longevity Serum. It's a 3/2. It's the Jinteki limit 1 per deck unique agenda. And out of all the limit 1 per deck agendas you can play in System Gateway, this is by far my least favorite. All the other limit 1 per decks are incredible, and this one is very sleepy. It does a bit of recursion, which is good. Getting cards back into our deck is nice. Make sure they don't know where all the Urtica ciphers are. That's valuable, but it's just not a really powerful ability. That being said, it is a 3/2 agenda, and 3/2 agendas are actually kind of fascinating. Because on a turn, if we do install Advance our Longevity Serum, and the runner doesn't run it because they were worried about the Urtica ciphers, on the next turn, we can advance this and score it, and then we can actually play 2 Neurospikes, which won't do 6 net damage, that will do 4 net damage, but if the runner doesn't have a full hand of cards, there's a bunch of times where 4 net damage will be lethal, and that might be a surprise they're not ready for. So having a 3/2 you can score out cheaply and quickly is actually not too bad at all. Again, all we want to do is install Advance, and keep advancing. Now, still, this agenda is not incredible. It's not great to score out in the early game because you might not have that many cards in archives, but it is an okay card with a bit of recursion. And if you're flooded, you can get agendas out of your hand, throw them out, put them back into R&D. We'll play 1 copy for sure. Now, this means we need 7 more agenda points. And of course, all that's left is the neutral agendas. 7 is very uniquely an odd number, which means we cannot fill this in by just playing even pointed agendas. So we can't just jam in a bunch of 2-pointers. So we're going to end up in a similar spot that we did in our first deck, which we're going to play 1 copy of Superconducting Hub, just so we can hit 18 nice and cleanly. We don't want to play 19 agenda points often because it's easier for the runner to steal 7 points from a deck of 19 as opposed to 7 from a deck of 18. Now, Conducting Hub, if we score it out, it's okay. It's not really a great card to set up any sort of Neurospike plays because the points it's a really small number, but at least if we have more cards in hand, it's more likely for us to have our combo, and that is fine. It is what it is. This doesn't often help the runner win, so if they steal it, it often doesn't matter, but we'll just play it because we kind of have to here. That's sort of how System Gateway can be with some of the neutral agendas. And now we actually have to make a very interesting choice because we have 6 agenda points left, which means we can just pick one of these agendas and play 3 copies of them and then be done with it. We actually have an interesting decision here, and I think if you're building this deck, you can go one of 2 different ways, depending on your taste. Firstly, we have Orbital Superiority. Now, this is a card we avoided in the first deck we built because it was a card that cares about tags. It says when you score this agenda, if the runner is tagged, do 4 meat damage. That's a big number. But if the runner is not tagged, you just give them a tag. This card is fascinating because if the runner is tagged and we score this out, we do 4 meat damage. Now, if we have a click left, we can play Neurospike, which we've scored an agenda on the turn. That means the Neurospike will do 2 net damage, which means if the runner is tagged and we ever score out an orbital and Neurospike, that's a 6 damage combo. That is incredibly impressive and is exactly what the deck wants to do. We can just keep advancing the orbital till it's on 4 advancements. If the runner doesn't run it because they think it's an Urtica, we just score it, hopefully give a tag, and then maybe flatline relatively easily. That is a very cool line for the deck. However, we have to give the runner a tag, and that is not a very easy thing to do. Jinteki doesn't really give out tags too easily, so we're gonna have to import cards from other factions. So to see how good orbital superiority is, we have to see how easy it is for us to give a tag to the runner. And again, to see how we can do that, we're just gonna open up every single tab here besides the identity tab. We're gonna open up all the different factions, and I'm just gonna search X:tag, which will search text of all the cards in System Gateway to find out which cards can give or care about tags. Basically, which cards say the word tag on them. And we have a couple options here. So firstly, we have a bunch of cards that are just tag punishment. So if the runner is tagged, we can ignore those. We have some ice that gives the runner tags. This is actually really difficult to line up, where if the runner runs and we give them a tag with a ping, they have a click on their turn probably to remove the tag. Very importantly, as an overarching idea, the way that you often, as a runner, want to play against these sort of trap decks is you want to run early in the turn and then figure out what the trap is if you're going to run at all, and then spend the rest of your turn drawing up. One of the worst things you can do against a trap deck is run last click, because if you run the remote server last click and it turns out it is the Urtica Cipher, you might not have any cards in hand and you don't have the time to repair your hand. Now, if you end your turn with low cards in hand, it means something else on the table that's advanced, something like a clearinghouse or an agenda into Neurospike can flatline you. So it's very, very common that the runner wants to run early and then draw up later in the turn so they can find the risk and then, fix things if things have gone poorly. That means ice inherently that gives the runner tags is not the easiest thing to combine with this sort of strategy, because the runner shouldn't be running last click into a ping, if you ask me. Similarly, cards like Pharaohs, it's very expensive. We have some send a messages, so it might be nice to res this for free, but it's up to the runner not to run last click, and they largely shouldn't be. Similarly, Funhouse, the same sort of idea. They shouldn't be running last click, as much as this ice is pretty annoying. Now, this only leaves a couple options. Firstly, we have Amaze Amusements, and this gives the runner tags, but only tags if they run and steal an agenda in the server. That means we have a really convoluted setup where we have to get another agenda. The runner has to run that agenda, take 2 tags, not clear the tags. We have to still have an orbital. It's asking for a lot to line up. So that means the obvious answer here is Public Trail. And Public Trail just says if the runner has made a successful run on their last turn, you can play Public Trail for 4 credits, and either the runner takes a tag or they can lose 8 credits if they have 8 credits. And that actually gives us a setup. The idea is that if we have on the table the orbital superiority and it has, say, 4 advancements on it, technically 3 advancements works as well. Our first click, we can advance the orbital superiority. Our second click, we can play the Public Trail. And if the runner doesn't want to or can't pay 8 credits, they suddenly have a tag. Then at paid ability window speed, we can score the orbital. Now they're tagged, so they'll take 4 meat damage. And on our final click, we can Neurospike them. This is technically the way I think you would set up this combo, is that you would play probably 2 copies of Public Trail and then 3 orbital superiority. And then you have another way to fork the runner, where if there's a quad advance card, a triple advance card on the table, Public Trail into orbital flatlines them. However, this is still hard to set up with some consistency, because for Public Trail to be online, the runner has to have ran last turn. And again, they have to have fewer than 8 credits. This makes me a bit nervous because we need to have an advanceable trap. We need to have the Public Trail. The runner has to have ran. The runner has to have fewer than 8 credits or doesn't want to pay the 8 credits. And to me, that is just too many conditions to feel super secure about this idea. But that doesn't mean you can't try this. If you want to build this deck, all I would ask you to do is play 3 orbital instead of the Off-World Office, which we'll probably play, and then just spend 4 influence on 2 copies of Public Trail, and that can work. It won't be as consistent, probably, worth some testing, but that is a totally cool way you can build this deck. However, the other option we have access to, let me just clear these search tabs. We'll go back to the neutral and Jinteki agendas. We'll clear this tag text. This is the other agenda we have, and it's Off-World Office. You've played this in the HB deck, and this is one of the best neutral agendas in all of System Gateway. It's one of the best neutral agendas, period. It just gives you 7 credits. Now, that inherently doesn't do anything with our net damage, our meat damage strategy, but it gives us 7 credits. A very important thing to keep in mind when you're building a deck, and even a deck that wants to flatline the runner using traps and damage, is that scoring points is actually really good for you. And that is because the sooner as a corporation that you are on game point, which is the term used to mean if we score another agenda, we can win the game, the more aggressive the runner has to be. If we're on 5 points or even on 4 points, and we go install Advance in the remote server with an Urtica Cipher, the runner has to consider running that right there and right then. Because if it's not an Urtica Cipher and they call it wrong, and we just install Advance to send a message really bravely, next turn we just score out, send the message, and we win. This is a really important concept to keep in mind, even with a trap deck, is the closer you are to game point, the more aggressive the runner has to be, and the more likely they are to have to interact with our traps. Sometimes that's bad for us if they're trashing our clearinghouses we're putting on the table, but sometimes that's good for us, and we have to understand if the runner has to be aggressive, it's more likely install Advance will end up doing 4 net damage. So keep that in mind. Just getting to game point makes the runner more aggressive and forces them to interact with us and gives them less time to draw up and be cautious and find their extra hand size card if they're playing. They just have to deal with us sooner than later. And for that reason, I think playing an off-world office is actually kind of reasonable as a nice little agenda we can score out in the early to mid game to give us 7 credits and just put on more mounting threat as we get closer to 7 points. Now, of course, keep in mind, just like Longevity Serum, but slightly harder because it requires 1 more advancement. If you get the off-world office up to 3 advancements by just continuing to advance your traps, if you score this out, you'll get 7 credits. And if you have 2 clicks left, you can do 4 net damage by playing 2 copies of Neurospike, which might flatline the runner, depending again on cards in hand. This is where you can also combine this with a clearinghouse, do some damage up front, finish them with the Neurospike, or if they ran an Urtica Cipher the turn before. You have a lot of options. And for that reason, I think we're going to play 3 off-world office to give us a bit more money so we can push out in the early game and score out. Advancing cards is expensive after all. But if you want to play the Orbital Superiority version and play some public trails, I think that's totally legitimate too. It will be less consistent, but it'll be much more flashy. Now let's just take a second to look at some of the card suggestions. As we said in the first video, 2 of these cards are generally auto includes in every deck we build. Firstly, Spin Doctor. This is going to be a 3 of in every System Gateway deck you build for so many reasons. It gives us card draw, which is nice to find our combo pieces. It gives us recursion to go get those Urtica Ciphers back into our deck. It is just absolutely phenomenal. Super importantly, also Spin Doctor is just such a good card in restoring humanity because it draws extra cards and then you can throw out your worst cards from hand or get maybe too many agendas. You can get some of those out of your hand and they will go face down into archives, which means you'll get a credit at the end of your turn. And if the runner runs archives where your agendas are or whatever it is, you can just shuffle those cards away at instant speed and not have an issue. So it is just such a flexible card. Again, Longevity Serum as a 3/2 does mostly what Spin Doctor does, but I honestly think Spin Doctor does it better, which is just kind of sad. For a 1 influence, 3 of card, this is why I don't like Longevity that much, but Spin Doctor, very easy 3 of, particularly as well in restoring humanity. Next up will be Hedge Fund as our auto include. We're going to play 3 copies of this just because it's a click for 4 credits button and we're going to need money. You can play it as soon as turn 1 and it's very, very easy and smooth to play. So why not? At this point, we're at 22 cards in. We're literally halfway through deck building. We're going to be playing 44 cards and all we've done is agenda suites and our win condition. So let's just pad the rest of the stuff out. Next up, let's worry about ice. Again, as we talked in the first video, you want some amount of ice. Usually about 1/3 of your deck, give or take, should be ice. And we want ice of every type. So some barriers, some code gates, and some sentries just to force the runner to find the right breakers. That is important too, because we're doing net damage and there's a chance that our net damage could just hit some breakers. And if they lose all their fractors, our end the run barriers are going to do some good work. So we're going to go over to the ice tab. We're going to hide the agendas and we're going to look at every single faction. Now, the first thing we're going to do, which is really fun to do, we are at a deck that cares about cards in hand. If the runner has too few cards in hand, they can flatline either by touching our Urtica Cipher or by not touching our advanced cards that could be either Clearinghouse or a Neurospike threat. Which means we're, out of any deck in System Gateway, highly incentivized to play with all the cards or all the ice that does damage. So let's look at all the ice that does damage because they're pretty fun. So we search X to search for text and we'll just search damage and we'll notice almost all the Jinteki ice. In fact, every single Jinteki ice we can play does damage and we're going to play all of them. This is Diviner. This is the code gate. We did not play this in our first deck we built, but it's a cheap little code gate that does a net damage and sometimes ends the run. Now, unfortunately, with Buzzsaw being a thing in System Gateway, eventually the runner will probably break this for 1 credit, but in the early game, it is totally fine. If the runner face checks into this, they lose a card, and sometimes that keeps them out. I will often put this on central servers because it's just slightly annoying. I don't want to risk often putting very valuable things behind this because it doesn't always end the run. But very importantly for this deck, we actually don't need to score our agendas behind ice. We can just put them on the table because they'll look like traps and sometimes the runner won't run it, even if there isn't any ice. We'll talk about that in a moment, but I'll play 3 Diviner because it's fine. Next up is Karuna. This is our most expensive Jinteki ice, and it's technically quite annoying to break. Most runners will break this somewhere between 3 and 4 credits, but it's also a nasty face check. If the runner runs into this, they'll definitely take 2 net damage. If they want to really push their luck, they can take another 2 net damage. And if the runner loses 4 cards in hand, it is very easy for them to flatline to an Urtica Cipher, a Clearinghouse, or a Neurospike threat. Now, normally when we talked about the original deck we built, we put this on central servers because our corporation deck did not care about doing net damage in the remote server when we played Precision Design. However, we do. This is actually a card that I'll put on the remote server because if the runner goes to the Karuna and the Subroutine's Fire and they're accessing with 1 to 2 cards in hand, Urtica Cipher flatlines them. This is just like such a cool thing about Netrunner is that your ice positionality and what kind of ice you want to play entirely depends on what your game plan is. And our game plan is just to make the runner not want to access cards when they have too few cards in hand, which means Karuna is a really good thing to put on the remote server. So we're going to play 3 Karuna. We'll put these on centrals. We'll put them on the remote server. It's just great if the runner runs into this aggressively and we get cards out of their hand. We'll play 3 copies. Finally, we have Tithe. This is another Sentry, and Tithe is just one of my favorite ice in System Gateway. We spent a lot of time talking about this already, but if we res this for 1, get the credit back, take a card out of the runner's hand, it is just a really great trade for us. Notably too, Restoring Humanity gets a credit again at the end of the turn if there is a face down card in Archives. So we want to get a face down card in Archives, and we just want to make sure the runner doesn't run it cheaply. If we don't ice Archives, the runner can spend a click running Archives and flip the card face up. And that means that card will not be face down next turn. And so instead of getting infinite credits, we only got 1 credit off of it. That is why a lot of times I want to put a cheap little ice in front of Archives, whether it's a Tithe to just be annoying or even a Diviner to sometimes end the run. And this sort of ice here makes it difficult for the runner just to spend a single click to turn off our ability. If they have to go through a Tithe every time to do that, they might not do that every time. So I really value these cheap little annoying ice to put on Archives to keep our ability more relevant and more interesting on more board states. We'll play 3 of these. Now we're already at 9 ice. Specifically at this point, we're missing barriers. So let's just look at our barrier options. We're going to either have to play the neutral options or spend a bit of influence here. To search for a subtype, and barrier is a subtype of ice, we do S:barrier, and it'll show us the 4 barriers in System Gateway. Now, firstly, we have some out of faction stuff. We have Ping, which is the ice that cares about tags. We don't really care about tags, and I wouldn't play this in a deck unless the deck cares about tags really, so I'm not going to consider it. Second, we have Pharos, and Pharos is big. If you advance it, it gets even bigger, which is nice. But our deck inherently doesn't need to really have that much big ice because at the end of the day, our threat is about the advanceable traps, not can you get through our ice to touch our advanceable traps. Now, there's some value to keep the runner out of the remote server. You can play Glacier Clearinghouse, and this is where I do think you can actually play a deck like this in Built to Last, Build the Wayland deck, where you play some big ice and some clearinghouses and you just keep advancing them and play some amount of Urtica Ciphers. But in this list, I don't think we want to spend 3 influence on this. We'll try and find a better way to spend influence because this is a lot of influence and we don't really need a big ice like this. Finally, we have Brawn, and I just like Brawn. It's 2 influence, so it's a bit easier to play. Now it's 6, which will make it the most expensive ice in our deck, but also it's very important to keep in mind, we're playing 3 copies of Send a Message, so we probably should have some expensive enough ice in our deck because if the runner steals this, we want to get something for it. For what it's worth, Send a Message resing a Karuna is like, it doesn't feel amazing because the big value of Karuna is if the runner face checks into it, they end up losing at least 2 cards from their hand. Now, while we res this for free is nice because we've gained 4 credits functionally, the runner will never bumble into this in a bad spot if they are worried about doing that. So it's a bit of a mixed bag. I think we can play 1 or 2 Brawn. For now, I think we'll play 1 Brawn and see how it goes. But this is the sort of ice that, yeah, we will put on a remote server. Maybe we'll put it on R&D against a conduit deck if it comes down. But this is our 1 annoying ice in terms of like making the runner spend some amount of money. They can always click through this, of course. And if they click through it, that's honestly fine. Because if they have no turn left and they run and hit an Urtica Cipher, well, they have no cards in hand. And that might be an easy board state to capitalize on. So we'll play a single Brawn. That leaves us with Palisade, and I think we'll actually play 3 copies of Palisade. This is just nice and cheap. And again, if we do some amount of damage and we knock the cleavers or the fractors out of the runner's hand, it's nice to have something that does end the run. This is relatively cheap. We don't want to put it on central servers, the remote server, where this is 4 strength. That's quite good, but we'll play it just because we want to play some amount of barriers, and I don't want to spend influence on too much else. Now, this takes us to 13 ice, which is just about where we want to be. Notably, our deck is very different than the Precision Design deck. Our HB deck really cared about ice because it wanted to put good ice on the table, play some defensive upgrades, and really protect their agendas. But at the end of the day, a lot of the shenanigans we can do, we can just do on the table with uniced servers and just say, you can touch it. You just don't know if it's an Urtica or not. So we don't probably have to play as much ice as some other decks will. Now, just to double check if we're not missing anything, I'm going to check out all the code gates. And the only other code gate we really want to play in this deck might be Whitespace. Funhouse is influence and it cares about tags, and we inherently don't. The problem with white space is that it's very similar to Diviner. It's a very cheap code gate that sometimes ends the run, but at the end of the day, white space is broken for 1 credit for most icebreaker rigs, and Diviner is broken for just about 1 credit, give or take, in most icebreaker rigs in System Gateway. If that's the case, I don't want to have 4 or 5 ice in our deck that are broken for 1 credit, because that just kind of feels pretty bad. So I don't think we're going to play any more code gates here. When it comes to sentries, I'd be surprised if there's anything else we want to play, because we're already playing 6 sentries. That's a lot. It's more than a third of our ice. The other options are on sell for a lot of influence, which I don't think we exactly need this. We're playing as many Karunas and ties as we can, and then we could play Ballista if we wanted to, which sometimes trashes programs and sometimes ends the run. I'm not too excited about this. I think there's a chance here we're okay with this much ice, only 13 ice, and then we can spend our influence to make our deck more consistent and more lethal on more board states. Again, we only need about 9 more cards, so it should be relatively simple to close this deck off. Let's just check the other tabs in order. So we're going to go to operations, and this will show us all the operations. Let's just clear that sentry search query. And here we have our options. So we have a couple options here. Firstly, in Jinteki, we haven't looked at this card yet. This is Hansei Review. And this is a really good card. For 1 influence, you'll play this pretty commonly in most System Gateway decks. You will at least consider it. And this card gains you 10 credits. So it's a click for 5 credits. However, if there are other cards in HQ, you have to trash one of them. That is a real downside. That is a real cost. So it's a 5 credit econ card, but it does cost 2 cards from hand. Notably though, the card you trash goes into archives face down, which means in Restoring Humanity, this on the baseline is a 6 credit economy card because it will fire your ability. And if the runner doesn't run archives, that's a 7 credit economy card, 8 credit economy card until that card in archives is flipped face up. Hansei Review is just so good as long as you have card draw and, extra cards to pitch to this, which you probably will. But it's just a very, very good card in Restoring Humanity. We're definitely going to be playing 3 copies of this. There's even a chance that this card could be considered better than Hedge Fund, specifically in this deck because it has good synergy. So we're going to be playing 3 of these. Now, at this point, we're just going to go through these options and see what we have. So we have Government Subsidy. It's another 5 credit economy card as long as we have 10 credits. I feel like with already 3 Hanseis, 3 hedge funds, and we might actually play a couple more assets that give us economy, this doesn't seem exactly necessary. We don't need big money. We're not raising huge ice. We just need enough money. So I don't think this makes a lot of sense. Otherwise, we could play Predictive Planogram. This is not a bad card. We played this in our Precision Design deck. And this, while we don't care about the tag text, either we can click for 3 credits, which is not bad, or we can draw 3 cards. The draw 3 cards I actually do think is pretty interesting. Having extra cards in our hand means it's easier to play Hansei Review, and if we play Anoetic Void, the upgrade that we haven't looked at yet, that allows us to discard cards from our hand to end the run, that also is quite nice. You saw how good that was in a Precision Design deck. So this is definitely a consideration. I think there's another consideration though that I might like a bit better, and that's Sprint, which is also 1 influence. Now, Sprint doesn't give you card quantity, it should give you card quality. When you play a Sprint, it allows you to basically get a new hand and shuffle things back. And inherently, we're a bit of a combo deck. Our deck only gets really lethal if we're holding multiple copies of Neurospike, so we need to find as many copies of Neurospike as possible as soon as we can. We're also not amazing at jamming agendas. Again, if we draw an agenda, we'll often just do install advance and say, it's an Urtica Cipher, what are you going to do? Run it? But this just gives us a lot of flexibility to fix our hand, to find our combo pieces, to find our Urticas, our clearinghouses, our Neurospikes, and I do value that a bit. We might end up in a situation where we just don't have enough ice in the early game. We only have 13 ice, which is slightly lower than some other decks. So also sprinting to just get some ice on the table in the early game can help. So we'll play 1 for now, and just remember we can play more copies of this if we want. Other options, again, we have Public Trail, which we could consider playing if we're playing Off-World Office. We have Retribution, which is a tag-based card. We don't care about tags. And then finally, we also have a very interesting card. This is called Seamless Launch. This card places 2 advancements on an installed card for 1 credit, as long as that card was not installed this turn. Now that text is really important. It's not like we can install an Urtica Seamless Launch Advance and then immediately have it on 3 advancements, which is pretty frightening. But Seamless Launch actually gives us another very interesting line. Say that we install Advance in Off-World Office. On our following turn, if we have the combo in hand, click 1, we can Seamless Launch the Off-World Office to get it to 4 advancements. We can immediately score it, and then we can just do Neurospike into Neurospike. Seamless Launch just allows us to get through these lethal combos slightly faster. Similarly, if we have a send a message on the table, say we did install Advance, if we just advance it once more, just get it to 3 advancements if we wanted to. And mind you, getting it to 4 advancements is actually pretty impactful because if the runner thinks it's an Urtica, the Urtica hurts that much more. But if we get this to 3 advancements, we can do click 1, Seamless Launch to get it to 5 advancements. We can score it out, and then we can do Neurospike into Neurospike for 6 damage. So Seamless Launch is a nice flexible card. We don't really need it on every board state, but if we can include into our deck, it does allow us to get our advancements faster, which for Neurospike combos actually really can matter. So I think for that reason, we can consider 1, You could also play 2 of these if you really wanted to, and it makes the off-world offices easier to score out, the same way in Precision Design, they're easier to score out. But for now, we'll play 1 and then see with influence what we can do. We only have 1 influence left over, so we'll see, again, if we want to move things around. But Seamless Launch actually works really well in a deck that wants to advance things quickly and then sometimes do a bit of a combo. And that's all our operations, so that's nice. We only need 4 more cards. So we're just going to check out the Assets tab and the Upgrades tab. Now, upgrades, there are only 4 options. Firstly, for NBN, this is too much influence. It does give tags. We don't really care about that. We'll ignore that. We can play Managarm Skunkworks. This is the HB defensive upgrade, and we actually don't need defensive upgrades. We just want the runner to be scared of our cards on their own. We know you can get in, but the question is, do you want to get in? So this doesn't always make sense. And then we have a very interesting card. This is Malapert Data Vault. This is another very important card for a combo deck like this. However, it is 3 influence. Now, what Malapert says is, if it's in the server where you score an agenda, as long as you res this for 1 credit, you can go search your deck for a non-agenda card and add it to hand. This actually gives a lot of consistency to some of these combos. So say that you have a send a message in a remote server, and on top of it, you have a Malapert. When you score out the send a message, you can use the Malapert to grab a Neurospike. So you're always guaranteed to have at least 1 Neurospike, which means if you have another Neurospike in hand, you'll have the 6 net damage combo. That actually can be pretty important. Now in this deck, because we're 44 cards, and we're already playing 3 Neurospikes, I don't think we necessarily need this sort of card slot, but this is another really cool card to play a combo like this, probably in Wayland, where you don't have to spend influence on this card. So imagine in a Wayland deck, you could play maybe 2 copies of Neurospike, hope to naturally draw 1, and then you grab the second one with Malapert Data Vault. I think that makes a lot of sense. The way we spend our influence, not really, but a very valuable card when it comes to Neurospike combos. And the last upgrade we have is Anoetic Void, and it's in faction, so we spend no influence. And this is, as you saw in the first deck we built, one of the most powerful cards on System Gateway. We can just keep the runner out of the remote server, out of any server, Central Server 2, depending where you put this, by just paying 2 credits and trashing 2 cards from hand. Trashing 2 cards from hand is nice as well with Restoring Humanity, because those cards go in face down, so as soon as the next turn, we'll get a credit if the runner doesn't run archives. And it's also a card we can use to protect our remote server if we do have a lethal setup. So we have a send a message on 4 advancements, and we just want the runner not to run it, so we can get them in the Neurospike, the double Neurospike on the following turn. We can just protect it with the Anoetic Void. You can use the Anoetic Void to protect the clearinghouse as it's getting closer to lethal advancements. It's just a very flexible and very useful card. The runner finds this, they'll definitely trash it because it's incredibly powerful, but having the ability to keep the runner out of a server, guaranteed for at least 1 turn to hold on to the combo, is definitely worth something. I won't play 3 copies because we don't really want 1 in our early hand. Again, we're not a super defensive deck, but it's a very valuable card, and for no influence, we'd consider it for sure. So we'll play 2 influence. Now this leaves us with only 2 card slots. 44 is where we want to be. So we'll just check out the assets really quickly. We have a couple options. Firstly, we have some economic options. We have Nico Campaign for influence. We don't have 2 influence, but Nico is fine. And then we have what's probably going to be the most recommended card here, Regolith Mining License. And Regolith is just probably an auto-include in every deck you build on the corporation side and System Gateway. It has a lot of money on it, and you want to click this button a bunch of times to get all the money off of it. And our deck is not any different really here. Now, I think we have a really interesting choice here on how many copies of Regolith we want to play, because notably our deck needs money, just like every corporation deck needs money, but we need less money potentially than the Precision Design deck that we built in the last video in this series, the last corp video. And that's because that Precision Design deck wanted to score out a bunch of agendas, and it needed to res a whole bunch of ice. A lot of the ice in that deck costs 6 to res, and our ice is overall a bit cheaper. We also notably have Restoring Humanity's ability to give us slightly more credits throughout a game, hopefully, so we might not be that taxed out on credits. So I think a totally fine option here is to either run 2 or 3 Regolith Mining License. Now I think we're going to play 2, just because it's a very valuable card we can push in the remote server. It kind of looks like an agenda maybe in the early game, but if we can force the runner to face check into a Karuna to trash a Regolith, we're pretty happy. So we'll play 2 for now. Now this takes us to 44 cards, which is perfect, but also we haven't spent all our influence. We have 1 influence left over. And while you're totally allowed to play a deck that has 14 influence in it, you don't have to spend any of your influence. You largely want to, because it gives more tricks to your deck and makes your deck more unpredictable and can give you strengths where your faction didn't inherently have strengths without spending that influence. Now we've looked at all the cards so far in System Gateway, which is pretty wild. And I think the one card we might want to consider to have a bit more consistency is another Sprint, possibly. Or if you wanted, you could also play another copy of Predictive Planogram to get slightly more card draw into your deck. I think they're both fine. Potentially we could do 1 planogram to get slightly more options and have flexibility of draw 3 cards or gain 3 credits. And draw 3 cards is really quite nice with Anoetic Void and just having cards in your hand to discard with Hansei Review. So let's include 1 copy of Predictive Planogram. You can play Sprint here if you want a bit more consistency as opposed to burst raw draw. I think that might be fine too. But now we're at 45 cards and we definitely want to play 44. So we're just going to cut 1 card from the deck. Now, this might sound pretty wild, but I think we're actually going to cut one copy of Hedge Fund. This might be a bit of a hard sell, but I do think our deck has Hansei Review, which on some board states is just a better Hedge Fund. Again, we're going to be losing cards from hand, but our deck only needs so much money. And we have Restoring Humanity, we technically have Planogram, we have Hedge Fund, Hanseis, and Regoliths. That might just be enough money. So I'm going to cut the Hedge Fund and say Hansei is better Hedge Fund in RH. If you want to play fewer Hanseis and more Hedge Funds, you can do that. But that'll take us to 44 cards. We're playing 18 agenda points. We spent all 15 influence, and this is our deck. Now, a thing we always do is we do some test draws to see what the deck looks like and have an idea. Would we keep this hand or would we mulligan? So we're going to draw 5 here. And are we going to keep this hand or are we going to do better? And I actually kind of like this hand. This is not bad. We got early economy, and often in most decks, you want to get your economy up on your first couple turns. And we have some nice early ice we can res. So with our top deck, we got a second agenda, slightly ugly here. So I think we'd want to have Karuna as a remote server ice to scare the runner slightly. And then here we can probably just Hedge Fund, put the Diviner on HQ. We could have drawn first, which we probably would have considered. We can also just put the Regolith on the table, but I think we would have drawn first here. So we would have drawn first, got the Clearinghouse, played Hedge Fund, iced up HQ. And on the following turn, we could either put the Karuna on the table and put the Regolith behind it and see what happens, or we can just go put the Karuna on the table, install Advance the Offworld Office, and just say, face check my Karuna. You're not going to take 4 net damage and maybe die to a small Urtica. Another test draw, we get another 5. This hand is also okay. We want slightly more economy in this hand. So we have the early Clearinghouses, which are pretty expensive to advance. So I think actually we would end up mulliganing this. If we draw this, I think this is a fair bit better. We have a lot of card draw. We have Hansei Review. We have more card draw and a cheap ice. So we could start here by putting a Spin Doctor on the table, drawing 2. Here, we have no real big interest in pushing out the early Send a Message. So this is where you can Hansei Review the Send a Message to throw it into the bin. And then if the runner runs Archives, you can rescue it with the Spin Doctor. And here it's up to you. I honestly would consider putting the Tithe on Archives to kind of disincentivize the runner from flipping our cards face up and turning off our ability. You could also have obviously put a Tithe on R&D. We don't really care if the runner runs HQ here. And from there, we actually think we're in an okay spot. That's not too bad. But overall, that is this deck. It cares about net damage. Now, all you want to do is stabilize your economy slightly in the first couple turns and then just install Advance. If the runner doesn't run it, keep advancing. And then, of course, we have a couple tricks. Firstly, if they run into a big Urtica, that can be an issue for them. But otherwise, it could be a big Clearinghouse, which can flatline them or help set up a flatline. And of course, if there's an agenda on the table, just go ahead, score the agenda, and then do 1 or 2 Neurospikes to finish the game. Get to game point, like do score out points if you can, just because the closer you are to game point, the more aggressive the runner has to be and the less cautious they can be, because any install Advance could win you the game on the next turn, and they have to keep that in mind. Now, this deck actually might be a bit tricky to play on Chiraboga, which is the bot website that we showed in the last video. It's absolutely fantastic, because I do not know how Chiraboga risks running traps. I have no idea what that calculation is like. This is a really fun deck to play in person because you can do install Advance and just goad your opponent, and kind of getting into their head and understanding if they're cautious or not cautious is where the fun really lies. And it's such a big part of Netrunner. So enjoy install advancing your Urtica Cipher and just sitting there and continue advancing it. And that is our System Gateway Deck Building 101 for a damage deck. And I think, again, for System Gateway only being 41 or so corporation cards, you actually have a whole bunch of different archetypes. So shout out to all these damage archetypes and advanceable traps, which are generally a crowd favorite when it comes to bluffing in Netrunner. If you enjoyed content like this, if you want to leave a like on the video, that is incredibly appreciated. We'll be back with some more Deck Building 101. It might take us a week or so because we're off for the holidays, but thanks so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoy. Ciao. Hey, thanks so much for watching. Hopefully you're enjoying a bit of an alternate win condition in System Gateway. There are 3 other options. I do think tags is the next thing we have to explore on the corporation side, and you can make tag quite annoying for the runner, even make that a flatline plan, of course, with public trail orbital superiority. We'll get to that, I think, in a bit. Thanks so much for watching. Again, if you're getting into this game, I've got a lot of feedback from folks getting into Netrunner. If you're picking up System Gateway, maybe you just got it for the holidays. Welcome to the game. If you have any questions at any point in time in this video, please, I hope you have asked them by now in the comments. Otherwise, I want to give a huge thank you to all these names here and more. We're supported on Patreon, which gives me the time to put these videos together, live streaming, editing, all the sort of stuff that happens. This channel just would not be like the way it is without support from all these names here. And of course, very kindly, our daily cast patrons as well. If you want to support Netrunner content like this, you can find the link in the description. You just want to like the video. That also helps a heck of a lot. Subscribe to the channel, the YouTube algorithm. All that stuff is really important. Now, by the time this video is up, I am off on holidays. Hopefully you're having a great time this holiday season at the end of 2024. Normally we do stream twice a week on Tuesdays and Thursdays. So if you're a newer player getting into this game and you want to hang out in a live session, ask some questions, see what a bit of the bigger card pool looks like, I would love to have you. It's a great way to learn more about this game and meet the rest of the community. Netrunner is kind of incredible. But with that, we'll be back in about a week. Again, there's no streams this week, unfortunately, but we'll be back before the end of 2024 to get in a stream or two. Hopefully we'll see you then. Thanks so much for watching. Ciao.